Hey guys, tonight I want to tell you about the most powerful woman on Wall Street and why you've never heard her name. Not because she failed, not because she faded quietly into history the way so many women did, but because she won, completely, ruthlessly, on her own terms, and the men around her could not stand it. So they did what men have always done when a woman beats them at their own game. They called her a witch. October 1907. Wall Street is dying, not struggling, not stumbling, dying. Banks are locking their doors. Lines of terrified depositors stretch around city blocks in the cold October air. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the most respected financial institutions in New York City, has just collapsed, completely gone. And the panic spreading outward from that collapse is moving like a fire through dry grass. Now, there is no Federal Reserve. Think about that for a moment. There is no government safety net, no FDIC insurance, no emergency mechanism, no phone calls the president can make to stabilize anything. When President Theodore Roosevelt looks at what is happening on Wall Street in October of 1907, he is essentially powerless. The federal government has no tools to stop financial panic. So, Roosevelt does the only thing he can do. He asks for help, not from Congress, not from the Treasury, from one man, J.P. Morgan. Morgan sets up a command center at his private library on Madison Avenue, a marble building that looks like a European palazzo filled with Renaissance paintings and rare manuscripts and an air of absolute authority. He calls in the presidents of every major bank and trust company in New York. He tells them what they need to do. And then, this is the part that became legend, he locks them in. He took the key. He tells them no one is leaving until they agree to pool $25 million to save the failing trusts. They sit through the night, arguing, negotiating, afraid. By morning they agree. Morgan saves Wall Street. That is the story. That is the legend. That is the version written into every history book, taught in every finance class, and repeated in every documentary about the Gilded Age. J.P. Morgan saves Wall Street. Now. I want you to hold that image in your head. Morgan in that marble library, locked doors, panicked bankers, the savior of American finance. Because I'm about to show you something that happened across town at the exact same moment, in a room that couldn't have looked more different. A borrowed desk. Inside the Chemical National Bank. A plain wooden chair. A woman in a worn black dress that she has been wearing for years. Literally years. The same dress. Because she sees no reason to spend money on a new one when this one still functions. On the desk, a bowl of oatmeal. Cold. She heated it on her office radiator earlier in the morning, the way she does every day, because she is not going to pay restaurant prices for lunch when a pot of oatmeal costs almost nothing. She is 72 years old. Her name is Hetty Green. And the men who are currently begging for her money, the men whose financial empires are crumbling, the men who run the banks, the men who sit in the clubs she was never allowed to enter, the men who have spent 30 years calling her a witch, those men are about to find out what happens when you spend decades mocking the only person on Wall Street who actually prepared for this. She picks up her pen. She starts writing checks. Let me tell you something about Hetty Green that no one ever says first. She was right. About everything. She was right about the panic of 1873. Right about 1884. Right about 1890. Right about 1901. Right about 1903. And 4 years before October 1907, she stood up and told anyone who would listen, and not many would, that the markets were overheated, that men were borrowing too much on too little, that the whole glittering edifice of the Gilded Age was built on nothing more substantial than other people's optimism. And when it fell, she said, it would fall hard. They laughed at her. They wrote columns mocking her. They called her paranoid, eccentric, deranged, a miser, a madwoman. And then, in October 1907, every single thing she predicted came true. So, when I tell you this is a story about injustice, quiet, slow, institutional, grinding injustice, I need you to understand. I'm not talking about the kind of injustice that announces itself. I'm talking about the kind that wears a respectable suit and writes complimentary profiles about J.P. Morgan while barely mentioning the woman who helped finance the rescue. That's the injustice, the erasure, and we are going to undo it tonight. But we can't start in 1907. We have to start at the beginning, because nothing Hetty Green did makes sense unless you understand where she came from, and more importantly, what was done to her before she ever set foot on Wall Street, on New Bedford, Massachusetts, 1834. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. This is not a quiet fishing village. This is a city that smells like money and salt and rendered whale oil. A smell so thick and penetrating that visitors describe it as something you cannot wash off. The harbor is crowded with ships, enormous ships, built for voyages that last 2, 3, and 4 years. Voyages to the Pacific, to the Arctic, to every ocean on Earth. Voyages from which not every man returns. New Bedford, in 1834, is the wealthiest city per capita in the entire United States. And the source of that wealth is whale oil, the fuel that lights the lamps of America and Europe. Every lantern on every street in New York, London, Paris, many of them burning because of the ships that sail out of this harbor. Henrietta Howland Robinson is born into this world on November 21st, 1834. Not into poverty. Let's be very clear about that, because the story of Hetty Green is sometimes misread as a rags to riches story. It is not. She is born into one of the wealthiest whaling families in New England. Her grandfather, Isaac Howland Jr., owns more whaling ships than almost any other company in the city. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, has married into the Howland fortune, taking Abby Slocum Howland as his wife, and has become one of the most successful merchants in the China trade. She is born wealthy. What she is not born with is a son's access to any of it. Here is the world Hetty Robinson enters in 1834. Women cannot vote. Women in most states cannot own property in their own name once married. Women cannot sit in boardrooms. I cannot attend universities, cannot open bank accounts independently, cannot enter into legal contracts as free agents. Women of the wealthy class are raised for one specific purpose: to be presented, to be charming, to attract a suitable husband, and to hand over their inheritance to that husband the moment they say, "I do." The law calls it coverture. The moment a woman marries, her legal identity is absorbed into her husband's. She essentially ceases to exist as a separate legal person. That is the world Hetty Robinson is born into. Now, given that world, given those constraints, what would you do if you were brilliant, mathematically gifted, and sitting on one of the largest fortunes in New England? What would you do? Think about that. Because everything Hetty does for the next 81 years is the answer to that question. By the time she is 6 years old, Hetty is doing something unusual. Her grandfather's eyesight is failing. He can no longer read the financial papers himself. And so, every morning, little Hetty sits beside him and reads them aloud. Not because she is told to, not because it's her duty, because she wants to, because the numbers make sense to her in a way that almost nothing else in her sheltered world does. By 8, she understands compound interest. By 13, she is keeping the family accounts. Her father and grandfather, to their credit, and to their pragmatic advantage, let her. They are Quakers, plain speech, plain dress, a profound moral aversion to debt, a belief that display of wealth is vulgar, that frugality is not deprivation, but faith. These values sink into Hetty like roots. When other little girls in New Bedford are learning embroidery and French, Hetty is learning bond prices. She has no brothers. She is the only child. And somewhere in the counting house of the Howland family business, with the smell of salt water and ledgers around her, a girl is being made into something the 19th century has no category for. They will invent a category later. They will call it a witch. By the time Hetty is a young woman, her father has come to a decision. He wants her to be married. Of course he does. That is what fathers of wealthy daughters do in the 1850s. He fills her closet with expensive fashionable dresses, silk, fine fabrics, the kind of clothes that announce to eligible gentlemen, this woman comes with money. Hetty takes the dresses and she sells them, every single one, and she takes the money and buys government bonds. I want you to sit with that for a second. A young woman in the 1850s, before the Civil War, before women can vote, before women have almost any legal rights at all, takes the dresses her father bought to help her attract a husband, sells them, and invests the proceeds in government securities. That is not the behavior of someone who does not understand money. That is the behavior of someone who has decided at a very young age that she will not be a decoration. The press will spend the next 60 years mocking her for wearing cheap black dresses. They will never mention the bonds. We can't start in 1907, because right now we need to talk about 1865. And what happened when the people Hetty Green loved most in the world died, and left her to fight for what was hers. Here is something nobody tells you about being a grieving daughter in 1865. The law did not care, not about your grief, not about your mother's wishes, not about your grandfather's vision of what should happen to his money after he was gone. The law cared about procedure, about forms, about the opinions of men with impressive titles who had never met you and owed you nothing. And Hetty Robinson was about to learn that lesson the hardest possible way. It starts with loss, real, human, unmerciful loss. In the spring of 1865, Hetty's father, Edward Mott Robinson, the man who had taught her to read financial papers, who had let her into the counting house when no one else would, who had shaped everything she understood about money and discipline, and the terrifying volatility of a world without guarantees, dies. She is 30 years old, yet within months of her father's death, her Aunt Sylvia Ann Howland dies too. Aunt Sylvia had raised Hetty through much of her childhood, during the long years when Hetty's mother Abby was too ill to care for her. Sylvia was the closest thing Hetty had to a true maternal presence. And now she is gone. Two people she loved. Two pillars of the world she had grown up inside. Gone within months of each other. The grief is real. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. But the grief is immediately complicated by something that follows death in wealthy families. Like weather follows a storm front, the reading of the will. Hetty's father leaves her approximately $1 million outright, an income from trusts worth several million more. That alone would make her one of the wealthiest women in America. Most women would have stopped there, accepted the inheritance, found a suitable husband, and handed the whole thing over. But Hetty's eyes are on something else. Her Aunt Sylvia's estate, worth approximately $2 million. Sylvia's will, as written, places roughly half the estate in trust for Hetty's benefit and distributes the rest to various other bequests. Half of $2 million. Not nothing. Not by any measure of 1865 prosperity. But Hetty believes there is another will, an earlier will, one that gives her everything. She produces it. It is a document that leaves Sylvia's entire estate to Hetty outright. No trust, no conditions, hers, completely. And attached to it, a handwritten addendum in Sylvia's own hand, revoking all later wills. Hetty takes this document to court. The case is called Robinson versus Mandel. It is 1868, and it is about to become one of the most sensational legal battles of the entire 19th century. Now, I want you to understand something before we go any further. Whether Hetty Green forged that will is a question historians have argued about for over 150 years. I am not going to tell you she definitely did. I am not going to tell you she definitely didn't. What I am going to tell you is what happened in that courtroom, and then I want you to sit with what it means. The trial attracts enormous attention. Hetty's legal team is impressive. They bring in Louis Agassiz, the most respected naturalist in America. They bring in Oliver Wendell Holmes, not the Supreme Court Justice, but his father, the physician and writer, a man whose name alone commands rooms. They bring in John Quincy Adams II, grandson of a president, and the opposing side counters with something Hetty's team does not expect. Mathematics. Benjamin Pierce, the Harvard mathematician, considered by many to be the greatest American mathematician of his era, takes the stand. His son, Charles Sanders Peirce, who will go on to become one of the founding fathers of American philosophy and logic, assists him. The Peirces have done something genuinely unprecedented in a courtroom. They had taken 42 known authentic samples of Sylvia Howland's handwriting and compared them to each other, painstakingly, downstroke by downstroke. 30 downstrokes per signature. 6 typically overlapped between any 2 genuine samples. On Hetty's disputed document, all 30 coincided, every single one. They have measured, they have analyzed, they have calculated. And they have reached a conclusion so precisely, it lands in the courtroom like a weapon. The odds that 2 signatures could be naturally, coincidentally, identically identical, not similar, but mathematically identical, are 1 in 2.666 times 10 to the 21st power. Let me translate that. That is a number with 21 zeros behind it. 2,666 million to 1 against natural duplication. What they are saying, in numbers too large for ordinary comprehension, is that the signature could not have occurred naturally. It was traced. This was the first time statistical evidence had ever been used in an American court of law. Benjamin Pierce essentially invented a new legal concept in real time, standing on a witness stand in 1868 to defeat Hetty Green. The court rules against her. She receives the trust income her aunt designated, roughly half the estate, but not the full amount she claimed. Here is the question I want you to hold. Did she forge it? I genuinely don't know. The mathematics say yes, but mathematics can be wrong about human situations. The case was decided not even on the forgery question directly, but on a procedural ruling. Under Massachusetts law at the time, Hetty was considered an interested party and therefore technically incompetent to testify in her own favor. The court essentially dismissed her testimony on procedural grounds before even fully adjudicating the forgery claim. A woman who could not testify on her own behalf in a case about her own inheritance, because a law decided she had too much interest in the outcome to be believed. The men with their equations and their prestigious institutional affiliations could testify. She could not. But here's what matters most, regardless of whether the will was forged or authentic. Hetty Robinson walks out of that courtroom having learned something that reshapes everything she does for the next 50 years. The legal system will not protect her. It will not protect her grief. It will not accept her word. It will not treat her as a credible witness in her own life. It will hear the mathematics of powerful men over the testimony of a wealthy woman and decide that the mathematics win. If she wants to keep what is hers, she will have to do it herself, without lawyers, without courts, without trusting any institution that can be turned against her. From this moment forward, she trusts no one. And the world will call that paranoia. 2 years after the trial ends, 2 years of newspaper coverage portraying her as either a tragic fraud victim or a scheming manipulator, depending on which paper you read. Hetty Robinson does something that surprises everyone who thinks they understand her. She is getting married. Not because she has given up on financial independence. Not because she has decided the courts were right and she should hand her money to a man. She gets married on her own terms, which is to say, she gets married in a way that the 19th century was almost entirely unprepared for. His name is Edward Henry Green. He is 46 years old in 1867, 13 and a half years her senior. He is a successful merchant who made his considerable fortune as a partner in the firm Russell Sturgis and Company, operating out of the Philippines and Hong Kong. He is cultured, literate, well-traveled, and, crucially, he has money of his own. He does not need hers. More importantly, he agrees to something almost no man in 1867 agrees to: a prenuptial agreement, complete financial separation. Her money is hers. His money is his. They live separately when their financial interests require it. She manages her own investments without his signature, his approval, or his interference. Let me be very clear about why this is extraordinary. In 1867, when a woman married, the law called it coverture. Her legal identity merged into her husband's. She could not sign contracts. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sue or be sued as an independent legal person. In the eyes of the law, she ceased to exist as an individual the moment she said, "I do." Hetty Green says no, not loudly, not with a public speech or a pamphlet or a march. Just quietly in a legal document, she says, "No, my money is mine. Sign here." And he does. For some historians, this prenuptial agreement is the single most radical act of Hetty Green's entire life. More radical than any investment. More radical than any confrontation on Wall Street. Because she did it before any of that. Before she was famous. Before she was powerful. When she was simply a 32-year-old woman who had just lost her family and her court case and her illusions about how much protection the law would offer her. She built a wall before she needed one. She was right, too. They have 2 children, Edward Howland Robinson Green, called Ned, born in 1868, and Sylvia Ann Howland Green, born in 1871, named for the aunt whose estate sparked the courtroom battle. That naming is either a tribute to genuine love for a woman she lost, or an act of extraordinary psychological complexity, depending on how you read Hetty Green. Maybe both, Marriage from the outside looks functional. Hetty and Edward move between residences, New York, Vermont, various cities as their financial interests dictate. They maintain a life together of sorts, but underneath the surface, a tension that will eventually become a rupture. Edward Henry Green likes to live well. This is the polite historical way of saying he is a man who enjoys what money can do when it is spent rather than saved. He likes the right clubs, the right wines, the social gatherings of wealthy men, the performance of prosperity that Hetty's Quaker upbringing had taught her to regard as essentially sinful. They are, in the deepest possible sense, incompatible. Hetty is managing investments. Edward is managing his appearance. For years, this coexists. It is not comfortable, but it functions. And then, in the 1880s, it stops functioning entirely. The details are disputed, as many details in Hetty Green's life are disputed. But the core of what happens is documented. Edward Henry Green has been speculating, borrowing, using, without Hetty's consent, her financial position, her name, her assets held at the brokerage firm, John J. Cisco and Son, as collateral for his own ventures. When the collapse comes in 1885, when the Cisco firm fails and the full extent of what Edward has done becomes visible, Hetty arrives at the bank. She demands her accounts. She is told her accounts are entangled with her husband's debts, that the money she put there, her money, protected by that prenuptial agreement, has been used as collateral for loans she never authorized. She is furious in a way that is very quiet and therefore very dangerous. She removes everything she can. She severs financial connections. She does not forgive this. She does not discuss it publicly. She does not write letters of outrage that historians can later quote for color. She simply closes the door, and she never fully opens it again. By the late 1880s, they are functionally separated. Not divorced in the 1880s, carried social consequences that would have damaged her ability to operate, but separated in every practical sense. Different cities, different lives, different money. Edward Henry Green dies in 1902. When he does, Hetty, who spent 35 years making sure he could not touch what was hers, takes over managing his estate too, because that is who she is. That is the iron logic of how she operates. She does not grieve. She does not pause. She manages. And now there is something I need you to hold on to, because it matters for everything that comes after. 3 things have happened to Hetty Green by 1885. 3 things that any person, man or woman, would take into the rest of their life like stones in a coat pocket. First, the courts told her that mathematics belonging to men she had never met were more credible than her testimony about her own family. Second, the man she trusted enough to marry used her financial position without her knowledge or her consent. Third, the newspapers, which had covered her father's death and her aunt's death and the will trial and now her husband's financial troubles, had never once written about any of it as a story about a brilliant investor. It was always a story about an eccentric woman, a difficult woman, a suspicious woman. These 3 things fuse together into a single lesson. She is on her own, completely, permanently, by necessity, not by choice. And the world, which has spent the last 20 years failing her in every institutional and personal way available, is about to start calling that lesson by a different name. It is going to call it a personality flaw. There is a wall she builds now, not made of brick or stone, made of habit, of routine. of rituals so specific they look to outsiders like the behavior of someone who has lost their mind. The cheap black dress she will not replace until it falls apart. The oatmeal she heats on the radiator in her borrowed office at the Chemical National Bank, because she will not pay restaurant prices for a lunch she can make herself in 10 minutes. The boarding houses in Hoboken and Brooklyn registered under names like Mrs. Dewey and Mrs. Norton, because if no city can establish where she legally resides, no city can reach into her income and take a portion of it. The keys she carries around her waist when she sleeps, not in a drawer, not on a hook, on her body, where no one can take them without waking her first. Every single one of these habits has a direct, logical, traceable origin in something that was done to her. They are not madness. They are memories. And the newspapers, who know nothing about what formed them, are going to give those habits a name. But we will get to that name in a moment, because right now something else is happening. Hetty Green is about to go to work, and she is about to become something Wall Street has never seen before, and will spend the next 40 years trying to explain away. The richest woman in America is about to start building an empire, one bond at a time, one railroad at a time, one panic at a time. The only tool she trusts is the one no one can take from her, her mind. They gave her the name in the 1880s, not one editor, not one headline. It crept in slowly, the way nicknames always do when they carry something the culture needs to say, but won't say directly. First in passing, then in parentheses, then without explanation, because by then no explanation was needed. The Witch of Wall Street. And I want to sit with that word for a moment before we go any further. Because witch is not a neutral word. It never was. In 1880s America, it came loaded with 100 years of Salem, with fire and accusation, with the specific cultural memory of women who had power they weren't supposed to have, and what happened to them. When the New York papers called Hetty Green a witch, they were not being colorful. They were issuing a warning. But let me back up, because by 1885, the year she discovered what Edward had done at the Cisco firm, the year she severed the last thread of real trust she had in another human being, Hetty Green had already built something remarkable. Something the papers hadn't figured out how to cover yet, because they had no template for it. She had built an empire, not overnight, not through luck, through a method so disciplined and so specific that it will take a minute to appreciate how strange it was in the context of the Gilded Age. Here's the world she was operating in. The 1870s and 1880s on Wall Street were a carnival of speculation. Jay Gould and James Fisk were manipulating railroad stocks on a scale so brazen it would be criminal by any modern standard, and was essentially criminal then too, but there were no laws to stop it. Men were forming trusts, corners, pools, engineering stock prices up and down by coordinating purchases across multiple brokers, then selling into the artificial peak before the price collapsed and took ordinary investors with it. Everyone borrowed, everyone leveraged. The whole architecture of Gilded Age wealth was built on the idea that if you controlled enough borrowed capital, you could control the market itself. And then there was Hetty Green, sitting in her borrowed office at Chemical National Bank in a dress that had been black 4 years ago and was now a color that newspapers struggled to describe, eating oatmeal she'd heated on a radiator because she wouldn't pay Delmonico's prices for a meal she could make herself in 10 minutes, buying nothing that she hadn't studied, selling nothing she hadn't already decided to sell 2 years earlier, borrowing nothing, ever. Let me tell you exactly what she bought. In the panic of 1873, when railroad stocks collapsed and half of Wall Street faced ruin, Hetty Green began buying. Not speculatively, not on a hunch. She had spent months studying which railroads actually moved freight, which ones had real assets, and which ones would survive when the paper schemes burned away. She moved into the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. She moved into the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. She bought government bonds when prices were low and yields were high. She bought mortgages from desperate sellers, men who needed cash immediately and had real property to offer as collateral, at terms that were profitable for her and survivable for them. She held, not for weeks, not for months, for years, for a decade in some cases. When prices recovered, and they always recovered, she was positioned to profit from the recovery without having risked her principal on the way down. This is what value investing looks like in practice. Buy when it's cheap. Hold when it's uncertain. Sell when everyone else wants in. Benjamin Graham would formalize this exact philosophy in 1934 in a book called Security Analysis. Warren Buffett would make it the foundation of one of the greatest fortunes in American history. Professors would teach it. Business schools would canonize it. But Hetty Green was doing it in 1873, without a book, without a professor, without a single person on Wall Street, treating her like she belonged there, now. Here is where the callback lands. Remember the oatmeal. Not as a punchline, not as a symbol of mental illness, as a financial instrument. Every dollar Hetty Green did not spend on rent was a dollar she could deploy when the next panic came. Every dollar she didn't spend on meals was compounding interest. Every dress she wore until it fell apart was capital. She kept liquid instead of converting into the appearance of wealth. Now, the oatmeal on the radiator was not poverty. It was arithmetic. She understood something that the robber barons, for all their genius and ruthlessness, never quite grasped. The enemy is not the competitor across the street. The enemy is your own spending. Every unnecessary expenditure is a reduction in the ammunition you'll need when the opportunity arrives. She had no office rent. She had a borrowed desk at a bank where she was one of the largest depositors, a bank that was very happy to offer her space in exchange for the privilege of holding her money. She had no staff, no secretary, no footman, no bodyguard, no personal accountant. She carried her own financial documents in a worn black bag. She read her own prospectuses. She walked her own properties. Because staff can steal, advisors can mislead. In anyone you pay becomes someone with a financial interest that may not align with yours. The courts had taught her that. Edward had confirmed it. So, she worked alone. And then came the word. It started in 1885. The same year the Cisco crisis broke. The same year she understood definitively that no institution and no person would protect her money except herself. The timing is not coincidental. The Witch of Wall Street. Look at what that word was doing. Look at what work it was performing in the culture. By 1885, Hetty Green was extraordinarily wealthy. She was one of the most powerful investors in New York. Men who ran railroads and banks negotiated with her directly. When she called in a loan, they paid. When she made an offer on a bond, the seller considered it seriously. She had real power, concrete, financial, undeniable power. And the word witch was how the culture contained that. Because witch doesn't mean powerful. It means wrongly powerful, unnaturally powerful, powerful in a way that makes other people unsafe. Now compare the vocabulary used for the men around her. J.P. Morgan, Titan, Colossus, the man who saved America. John D. Rockefeller, captain of industry, the architect of Standard Oil. Andrew Carnegie, steel magnate, the great philanthropist. Jay Gould, a man who had genuinely manipulated markets, bribed legislators, and financially ruined thousands of ordinary investors. Jay Gould was called a robber baron, which is still a baron, still nobility of a kind. Hetty Green, who had done none of those things, who had manipulated nothing, bribed no one, ruined no ordinary investor, was a witch. She was the ethical one, and she was the one who did it honestly, and she got the broomstick. Here is a thing that will bother you if you let it. The newspapers that called her a witch printed their stories about her eccentricities, the boarding houses, the false names, the constant moving, as evidence of madness, as evidence that something was wrong with her. But think about what those habits actually were. The false names, Mrs. Dewey, Mrs. Norton, when she registered at boarding houses in Hoboken and Brooklyn. This was not paranoia. This was tax strategy. If New York State could not establish her legal domicile, they could not claim jurisdiction over her income. After she died in 1916, New York State spent years trying to prove she owed back taxes. They lost because she had been too careful for too long for them to pin her down. The constant moving, same strategy, combined with genuine security concerns. She carried bearer bonds and financial documents worth thousands of dollars in a worn black bag. If she moved unpredictably under a false name at irregular intervals, no one could track her. No one could plan around her movements. The gun, she applied for a permit in 1902. When the sergeant asked why she needed it, she said, and this is a quote recorded by contemporary accounts, "I'm not much afraid of burglars or highwaymen, mostly to protect myself against lawyers." I want you to sit with that sentence. She was the richest woman in America. She had more money than most men in New York would ever see. And her primary fear, the thing that made her carry a weapon, was not criminals. It was the legal system. It was men with briefcases and procedural arguments who could take her to court and take her money with mathematical equations she couldn't argue against, in front of judges who wouldn't let her testify in her own defense. She was right to be afraid. She had the proof in a federal court ruling from 1868. But here is what the newspapers never printed. They printed the gun story as comedy. Eccentric woman gets gun permit, fears lawyers. The implication, she's lost her mind. They did not print, in the same stories, in the same breath, what she was doing with her money while they were laughing. By the late 1880s, Hetty Green's real estate holdings in Chicago, Manhattan, and Texas were generating income that most Americans couldn't comprehend. She owned mortgage loans on properties across multiple states. She held railroad bonds. She held government securities. She was negotiating directly with railroad boards, municipal governments, and financial institutions that needed capital. She was, by any reasonable standard, one of the most sophisticated financial operators in the United States. And she was a woman, which meant the newspapers covered her gun permit and her oatmeal, not her bond portfolio. Now I need to tell you about Ned, because Ned Green is the part of this story that forces you to feel something complicated. He was born in 1868, first child, named Edward Howland Robinson Green, after his father and his mother's family both. Called Ned, always Ned. As a boy, he was injured. The details vary, depending on which source you trust. A sledding accident in some accounts, a street cart in others. His leg was hurt. Badly. What happened next is the most disputed story in Hetty Green's entire biography. The legend, printed in newspapers, repeated in books, repeated now in articles and podcasts about her, is that Hetty refused to pay for proper medical care. That she took him to charity clinics, disguised as a poor woman, shopping for the cheapest possible doctor. That she delayed treatment because she could not bring herself to spend the money. And that the delay caused infection. And that the infection became gangrene. And that by the time she finally agreed to proper treatment, the leg could not be saved. Ned Green, child of one of the wealthiest women in America, had his leg amputated several inches above the knee. He wore a cork prosthetic for the rest of his life. If the legend is true, it is the most damning fact in her story, and it is the moment where discipline stops being a virtue and becomes something else. But here is what some historians argue, and I am not going to pretend this is settled, that she did take him to multiple doctors, that the free clinic may have been the first visit, not the only visit. That 19th century medicine genuinely could not save many infected limbs, even when treatment was prompt, even when money was no object. Children of wealthy families lost limbs to infection in the 1870s with the best available care. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Her cheapness almost certainly caused delays. But those delays may have encountered a medicine that couldn't help him anyway. What is not in dispute is this. Ned believed she cost him his leg, and he never forgave her. He didn't say so out loud while she was alive. He didn't have to. The way he lived said everything. Hetty died in July 1916. She left her estate, approximately $100 million, which is roughly $2.5 to $2.7 billion in today's money, equally between Ned and his sister, Sylvia. Ned inherited approximately $50 million. And then Ned Robinson Green, the boy who had grown up in boarding houses under false names, the man who had worn a cork prosthetic leg through his adult life, the son of the most disciplined accumulator in American financial history. He spent it, not carelessly, deliberately, methodically, as if dismantling his mother's philosophy brick by brick was itself a project. He bought a former government vessel, refitted and renamed it, and outfitted it with an arsenal of military weapons. Because Ned Green collected weapons the way other men collected stamps. He collected rare coins on a scale that would eventually make his collection one of the most significant in American history. He hosted parties. And just 3 weeks after Hetty's funeral, 22 days, he married the woman his mother had forbidden him to marry. A woman named Mabel Harlow, who had been his companion for years, whom Hetty had refused to acknowledge or allow through her doors. 1 month. He could not even wait for a season. And now the cliffhanger that should pull you into the next chapter. Because everything I've just told you about the newspapers, about the gun permit, about Ned, about the word witch doing its quiet work in the culture, all of it is prelude. The real test is still coming. Because in October 1907, everything Hetty Green built, every habit they mocked, every dollar she refused to spend, every panic she predicted and prepared for, all of it will be called upon at once, and she will be ready. She has been ready since 1903. The question is whether any of it will matter, whether a woman can save a city, sit in the room with the most powerful men in America, write checks that stabilize the financial system, and still be erased from the story they tell afterward. That answer is coming, and it is going to make you furious. In October 1907, when the American financial system came within hours of total collapse, when the President of the United States was sitting in Washington with no tools, no mechanism, no legal authority to do anything, the most powerful men in New York gathered in a marble library on Madison Avenue to decide the fate of every bank account in the country. And Hetty Green didn't need to be in that room. That is the fact that should be taught in every economics class in America, and isn't. While J.P. Morgan was locking bankers in his marble library, Hetty Green was holding court across town at the Chemical National Bank. And the most powerful men in New York, the ones who weren't trapped in Morgan's library, were coming to her. Because we talked, earlier in this story, about the word witch. We talked about how men who destroyed workers and bribed senators were titans and barons. And Hetty, who did neither of those things, was a witch. Now I want you to hold that word alongside this image. A woman in a worn black dress, 72 years old, sitting at a borrowed desk, and the presidents of banks are standing in front of her, asking for her money. They needed her. That is what nobody told you. Let me take you back 4 years, because the story of October 1907 doesn't begin in October 1907. That's the mistake every newspaper makes. That's why they got the story wrong. It begins in 1903 on a quiet afternoon when Hetty Green looked at asset prices and said something that the entire financial press dismissed as the paranoia of an old woman. She said, "It is coming." She said it in public. She said it on the record. The New York Times was not interested. Why would they be? Hetty Green, the witch of Wall Street, the woman who ate oatmeal on a radiator. What would she know about the trajectory of the American economy? So she stopped talking, and she started moving. She sold it. Quietly, methodically, property by property, bond by bond, she converted holdings into cash starting in 1903. While every other financier in New York was riding an intoxicating bull market, adding leverage, buying more, borrowing more, building paper empires on paper foundations, Hetty was doing the one thing no one on Wall Street respected. She was getting smaller. 4 years. For 4 years she accumulated cash and waited, and the men who laughed at her kept borrowing. October 14th, 1907. A Monday. A copper speculation scheme collapses. Now, most people on Wall Street barely noticed. Failed schemes were ordinary. This looked like Tuesday's news. But Hetty noticed, because Hetty had been watching copper prices for weeks. She knew who was involved. She knew how much they had borrowed. She knew that the men behind this scheme had borrowed so heavily that when it failed, the failure would travel like a crack through ice, invisible at first, then catastrophic. She accelerated her cash position. By October 22nd, it was no longer invisible. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, third largest trust in New York, solid, respectable, the kind of institution that made depositors feel safe, opened its doors on Tuesday morning to find hundreds of people outside. Not hundreds. By afternoon, thousands, standing in line, demanding their money back. Not because the bank had done anything visibly wrong that morning, because fear is a contagion, and it had spread overnight. Let me be precise here, because the history of this week matters. On October 23rd, Knickerbocker Trust closes its doors completely, fails. In one day, one of the most trusted financial institutions in New York ceases to exist. The panic spreads immediately. Every other trust company faces runs. Every bank starts hoarding cash. Credit, the lifeblood of every business, every payroll, every transaction, freezes. October 24th. The stock market crashes. Overnight lending rates. Call money, the loans that allow brokers to function every single morning, spike to 125% annual interest. Not 12%, not 20%, 125%. Which means effectively, credit is unavailable. The price is so high that it functions as a wall. Businesses could not operate. Payrolls could not be met. The American economy was hours from total, cascading collapse. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no FDIC. There was no emergency mechanism anywhere in the federal government designed to handle this. President Roosevelt sat in Washington, essentially helpless, watching private markets devour themselves. And what did Wall Street do? It is called J.P. Morgan. Here is what they want you to know about October 26th, 1907. J.P. Morgan, 70 years old, suffering from a cold, arguably the most powerful private citizen in America, summons the presidents of every major trust company in New York to his personal library on Madison Avenue. Not to a bank, not to a government building, to his private home. A marble palazzo stuffed with Renaissance art and rare manuscripts, where the ceiling was painted and the floors were imported stone, and the bookshelves were filled with illuminated medieval texts. He organizes a $25 million rescue pool. The Treasury Secretary deposits federal money into national banks. Morgan works through the night, multiple nights. One all-night session famously ends, or so the story goes, with Morgan locking the doors until every man in the room agrees to contribute, and it works. The pool stabilizes the trust of companies. Credit begins to flow again. The panic subsides. This is the story. J.P. Morgan, the hero of 1907. The man who saved America through sheer force of private authority when government had none. That story is true. I am not disputing it. It happened. But here is what that story leaves out, and this is where I need you to pay attention. She had something no one else in New York had in that specific moment. Approximately $25 to $31 million in immediately liquid reserves. Cash, real cash, not securities that needed to be liquidated, not collateral that required legal procedures. Cash sitting in accounts, ready to be written as checks. She was the only woman operating at that level in 1907, when women could not vote, could not own property in many states, could not attend most universities, could not sit in most boardrooms. Hetty Green sat at her borrowed desk at Chemical National Bank, and the titans of Wall Street had to come to her. Why? Not because they respected her, not because they'd stopped calling her a witch, because she had what they needed. And while Morgan was organizing the pool, Hetty was already writing checks. Here is something almost nobody knows. While the newspapers were filling their front pages with Morgan, Morgan the Titan, Morgan the Savior, Morgan who rescued American capitalism by sheer personal authority, Hetty Green had already done something quieter and arguably more direct. She had lent the city of New York $1.1 million, not to trust a company, not to a private banker, to the city itself. New York City, which was unable to meet its obligations because credit markets had frozen and no bank would lend. The city needed money to function, to pay its workers, to cover its bonds, to keep the basic machinery of municipal life running. Every bank in New York said no, or said yes at interest rates so punishing they amounted to no. Hetty said yes, at 5.5%. In exchange for short-term revenue bonds with excellent collateral. 5.5% Not 10, not 30, not the 125% the overnight lending market was charging. 5.5%, which was a reasonable rate, which was a fair rate, which was the rate she always charged when the collateral was good. In today's dollars, that loan was approximately $33 million. She didn't announce it. She didn't hold a press conference. She wrote the check, took the bonds, walked back to her desk, and went back to her oatmeal. And somewhere in the history of that morning is the fullest argument she ever made, not in words, but in arithmetic, for a principle that 6 years later Congress would put into federal law and name something else entirely. We talked about it as a symbol of her discipline, her refusal to waste, her strategic obsession with keeping every dollar in reserve. But I don't think I told you what it meant at this moment. In October 1907, while J.P. Morgan was holding emergency meetings in a marble library surrounded by Renaissance art, Hetty Green was sitting at a borrowed desk in the Chemical National Bank, eating oatmeal she had heated on an office radiator, and writing a check that kept New York City functioning. The oatmeal is not a joke. The oatmeal is the philosophy. The oatmeal is the entire argument. Every meal she didn't buy at a restaurant, every dollar she didn't spend on an office she owned, on a dress she didn't need, on a house that would advertise her wealth to people who might try to take it. Every one of those saved dollars was sitting in an account, liquid, ready. And when the city needed $1.1 million and every bank said no, she had it, because she never stopped having it, because she ate the oatmeal. This is not eccentricity. This is 40 years of compounding discipline, arriving at its exact moment of vindication. But here is where the story gets complicated. Here is where I need to ask you something directly. When J.P. Morgan lent money during the Panic of 1907, history called it heroism. When Hetty Green lent money during the same panic, making the same calculations, taking the same risks with excellent collateral at fair rates, what did history call it? Nothing. Mostly nothing. A few mentions. A few lines in financial histories, footnoted and then forgotten. The Witch of Wall Street, who also lent some money. Morgan gets the biography. Morgan gets the portrait in the museum. Morgan gets the name attached to the institution that eventually bears it. And Hetty goes back to the boarding house in Hoboken and is almost immediately written out of the story. Now, I want you to resist the instinct to make this simple, because the erasure of women from financial history is not simple. It doesn't happen because one editor made one bad decision. It happens because the story has already been structured in a way that has no place for her. The story of 1907 is a story about masculine authority stepping in where government failed. It's a story about power, specifically about a certain kind of power that is legible as power in 1907. A man in a marble library, controlling rooms, locking doors, summoning deference. Hetty Green's power didn't look like that. She didn't summon anyone. She didn't lock anyone in a room. She sat at a borrowed desk, ate heated oatmeal, and deployed 40 years of patient preparation in the form of checks with excellent collateral. That is the kind of power that doesn't photograph well, that doesn't produce dramatic newspaper copies, that doesn't fit the narrative of masculine heroism that the press of 1907 was already writing. So she was edited out, not conspiratorially, structurally. The story simply had no room for a woman who won without performing. In the weeks after the panic stabilized, something interesting happened in the newspapers. Coverage of Morgan expanded. He gave interviews. He was painted as a singular figure, the last private citizen with enough authority to function as a de facto central bank. Congress discussed how to handle this dependence on private power. A commission was formed. The conversation began that would eventually produce, in 1913, the Federal Reserve System. Coverage of Hetty Green returned to its usual register. What was she wearing? What had she eaten? Was she still refusing to turn on the heat in her boarding house? Was she still moving in the middle of the night to avoid the tax collector? The newspapers could not process what she had done in October 1907 without reframing the rest of the year as miserly, eccentric witch. Because if they acknowledged that the woman who bailed out New York City was the same woman who ate oatmeal on a radiator, if they had to treat those two facts as consistent rather than contradictory, they would have had to acknowledge something they were not prepared to acknowledge. The discipline was the strategy. The frugality was the mechanism. The oatmeal was the power. That acknowledgement would have required them to admit they had been wrong about her for 30 years. And institutions rarely admit 30 years of being wrong about a woman. Let me tell you what happened to J.P. Morgan. He died in 1913, 6 years after the panic he was celebrated for resolving. He died wealthy, famous, admired. A titan, as they always said. His library became a museum. His portrait hung in every history of American finance. His name became synonymous with American banking itself. I'm not telling you he was a bad person. I'm telling you something smaller and more devastating than that. I'm telling you that 6 weeks after the panic of 1907, after the newspapers had written their version of events, Morgan the hero, Morgan the savior. There was a woman sitting at a borrowed desk in the Chemical National Bank who had been making the same calculations, taking the same risks, writing checks of comparable effect, and whose name was appearing in newspaper columns adjacent to words like strange and peculiar and the Witch of Wall Street. And by the time those newspapers became history books, she was a footnote, or a caricature, or missing entirely. Remember the word witch. We talked about it at the beginning. We talked about what work it was doing in the culture, how it was a way of saying her power is illegitimate, her success is unnatural, her presence in this space is wrong. Here is what I want you to understand now. At this point in the story, having watched her spend 4 years preparing for exactly this moment and then execute it precisely, and then be written out of the history she helped create. The word witch did not just describe what people thought of Hetty Green. The word witch was a preemptive erasure. It was written before the history happened, so that when the history happened, it would already have a frame that made her invisible. You cannot be the hero of a story if the newspaper has already decided you're the witch in it. She was invited to the emergency consultations with Morgan during those weeks, not as a hostess, as a creditor, which, in that particular crisis, was the only credential that mattered. While Morgan organized his famous all-night session at the library across town, Hetty was already at her borrowed desk, writing checks. And they had already built the cage before she arrived. But here's the thing about Hetty Green that I want to leave you sitting with before we move forward. She knew. She knew they were writing her out. She knew the newspapers were going to give Morgan the credit. She knew that when the history books were written, they would find a way to make her irrelevant. She was not naive about this. She had survived the Howland will case. She had watched her own husband use her assets without her knowledge. She had spent 30 years watching men with less money and more access rewrite the rules in real time. She knew exactly what was happening, and she did it anyway. She sat in that room. She wrote those checks. She ate the oatmeal. She kept the cash. If she showed up to a fight she knew she was going to lose in the history books, because the fight in the present was the one that mattered. I'm going to tell you something now that I want you to hold all the way through what comes next, because it is going to become important. In 1908, a few months after the panic, the New York Times asked her directly, had she predicted it? Had she seen it coming? And she said, in her own words, not paraphrased, not reconstructed, directly quoted, "I saw the situation developing 3 years ago, and I am on record as predicting it. I said then that the rich were approaching the brink, and that panic was inevitable. When the crash came, I had money, and I was one of the very few who really had it. The others had their securities and their collateral. And I recognized the warning signs and began discreetly gathering my funds, executing a few new deals, and ensuring I had every available dollar of my wealth ready for the impending day I anticipated." Read that again. Not the tone of someone who is surprised, not the tone of someone who got lucky, the tone of someone who has been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. And now the question I want you to sit with. The question that is going to fuel the next part of this story, the part I promise you will be furious about. If she predicted it and prepared for it and executed her strategy precisely and was in the room when the solution was organized and personally funded New York City's obligations when every bank refused, then why does the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which created the permanent institutional solution to exactly the crisis she had just helped resolve, not contain her name anywhere? Why did the men who could not see the crisis coming build the system designed to prevent it from happening again, while the woman who had seen it coming 4 years earlier and prepared for it methodically and was correct on every count, why did she get to watch them build it from her boarding house in Hoboken? That answer is coming, and it is going to make you furious. Here is the thing nobody talks about: the same panic she predicted, the same crisis she founded, the same chaos she walked through quietly, writing checks while grown men wept in marble libraries. That panic became the single most consequential argument in American political history, and the men who used it as their argument never once said her name. So, let's go back, not to 1907. You know what happened in 1907 now. Let's go 6 weeks after. November 1907. The dust has settled on Wall Street. Credit is flowing again. The Knickerbocker Trust is dead, but its depositors are recovering. Theodore Roosevelt has thanked J.P. Morgan privately. The newspapers have printed their tributes, their full front pages of heroism, their engravings of a strong-jawed titan who saved civilization with his bare hands. And somewhere in Washington, a senator named Nelson Aldrich is reading every word of it, and furious. Not furious at Morgan. Furious at the situation that made Morgan necessary, because what had just happened, what the entire country had just witnessed, was this. The survival of the American economy had depended entirely on the personal willingness of one 70-year-old private citizen to spend his own money. One man, no institution, no mechanism, no plan, just Morgan. And Nelson Aldrich, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, understood something the newspapers did not say out loud. The next time a panic came, Morgan might be dead. What then? Stop there. Because this is where the story stops being about Hetty Green and starts being about what her existence proved. She had demonstrated, at scale, in public, in the middle of the worst financial crisis in a generation, that a single person holding cash against the tide could stabilize an entire system. Think about what that means. The Federal Reserve, which Congress would create 6 years later in December 1913, is built on one foundational principle. There must always be a lender of last resort. Always. Not sometimes. Not when a rich man feels generous. Always. Who had just been the lender of last resort for New York City. The woman they called a witch, not by design, not because anyone asked her to serve that function, but because she was the only one holding real liquidity when the system ran dry. She was, functionally, the Federal Reserve before the Federal Reserve existed, and the Federal Reserve was created specifically so that America would never again need someone like her. Here is how it happened, and pay attention, because this part moves fast, and the details matter. November 22nd, 1910. Jekyll Island, Georgia. In a private resort island owned by a millionaire's club so exclusively that its members included the Rockefellers, the Pulitzers, the Morgans. 6 men arrive by private rail car under assumed names: a senator, a treasury official, and 4 of the most powerful bankers in America. They travel under false names. They use only first names during the meetings. Senator Nelson Aldrich, A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, Henry Davison of J.P. Morgan and Company, Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who had spent years arguing that America needed a central bank. They tell no one where they are going. They tell no one what they are discussing. They spend 10 days on Jekyll Island designing what will become the Federal Reserve System. Why the secrecy? Because if the American public knew that a group of senators and Wall Street bankers were designing the nation's central bank on a private island owned by millionaires, it would never pass. The progressives of 1910 hated the idea of concentrated banking power. William Jennings Bryan had run 3 presidential campaigns on exactly the opposite philosophy. The memory of the great trusts, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, the railroad monopolies, was fresh and raw. So they hid, and they built something. What they built was elegant, actually. A federally chartered system of 12 regional reserve banks that would hold member bank reserves, lend to banks at crisis moments, and, most critically, control the money supply. A lender of last resort, permanent and institutional, that would never again require a JP, a Morgan or a Hetty Green to step personally into the breach. The Aldrich Plan, as it was called, died in Congress because the public figured out who had written it. Too much Wall Street fingerprint, too little public representation. But the core idea survived. Senator Carter Glass of Virginia, working with President Woodrow Wilson, rewrote the plan into the Federal Reserve Act. It passed both houses of Congress in late 1913. Wilson signed it into law on December 23, 1913. And here's the part that stops your breathing for a second. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 nationalized the function that Hetty Green had performed privately in 1907. Lend when no one else will lend, at reasonable rates, with good collateral. Keep the system liquid so the panic doesn't consume everything. That was her strategy. That was her oatmeal. And that was her radiator. That was the 30 years of discipline and isolation and mockery compressed into a financial function so essential that Congress eventually put it in a law. She proved the concept. They built the institution. Her name is not in the Federal Reserve Act. And now I want you to hold something very specific. Hold it tight, because this is the callback I promised you would feel. Do you remember the first word planted in this story? The word they used to dismiss her, to make her power seem unnatural and undeserved, to ensure that every time someone heard her name, they thought freak rather than genius? Witch. They called her a witch because she understood money in a way men found threatening. But here is what the word witch actually codes for in the English language. Go back to the original meaning. Not Salem, not broomsticks, older than that. A witch is a woman who knows something she isn't supposed to know. A woman whose understanding of hidden forces, natural forces, economic forces, forces that others can't see or won't acknowledge, puts her outside the acceptable order. The men who signed the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913 were acknowledging, in the language of federal law, that someone needed to be the permanent lender of last resort. That the thing Hetty had done in 1907 needed to happen automatically, institutionally, every time the system cracked. They built a government agency to do what she did alone, and 6 years before they signed that law, they called her a witch for doing it. But here's what I want you to understand about the years between 1907 and 1913. Those 6 years matter in a way the textbooks ignore. Hetty Green doesn't retire after 1907. She's 72 years old and she goes back to work. The boarding houses, the black dress, the borrowed desk, the oatmeal that nobody was photographing anymore because the newspapers had moved on. She is still buying. The distressed assets she purchased at panic prices in October 1907 are appreciating. Railroad bonds she bought at 40 cents on the dollar are recovering. Real estate she acquired from desperate sellers is generating rental income. Mortgages she originated at crisis rates are paying principal and interest every quarter. She is still doing, in 1908 and 1909 and 1910, exactly what she has always done. She watches the Aldrich Plan move through Washington. She watches the Jekyll Island story leak. Not the details, not at first, but the broad outlines. She understands what is happening. A central bank is coming, and she knows, because she understands monetary systems better than most senators, exactly what a central bank means. It means the government will now hold the liquidity that she has been holding privately. It means the next panic will have a mechanism to respond to it. It means the window, the specific, unusual, irreplaceable window she has occupied for 40 years, is closing. She keeps working anyway, because the window isn't closed yet. There is a detail in her final years that history gets wrong through the specific story it chooses to tell. The Guinness Book of World Records, the book parents bought their children, the book designed to celebrate human achievement, listed Hetty Green for decades under one category: world's greatest miser. Not world's greatest female investor. Not America's first self-made woman billionaire. Not pioneer of value investing. Miser. The entry focused on the oatmeal, on the dress, on the son's leg, on a death story so perfectly cruel and petty it reads like something a press room invented and a fact-checker forgot to question. Do you want to know what that death story said? It claimed she died of apoplexy after arguing with a maid about the virtues of skim milk. The New York Times, reporting her death within days of the event, said nothing of the kind. The Times said strokes, a series of strokes beginning in April 1916, worsening over the following months, leading to her death on July 3, 1916, at her son Ned's home in New York City. She was 81 years old, She had worked for 6 decades. She had predicted and survived and profited from every financial panic of the Gilded Age. She had bailed out a city. She had been the only woman in the most important room in America. She had built a fortune worth, in today's dollars, somewhere between $2 and $3 billion. And the book that tracked human achievement put her in the category of miser and made up a story about skim milk so that the lesson children took from her life was not genius, but greed. That is not an accident. That is a choice. Let's talk about what the Pujo Committee found in 1912, the year before the Federal Reserve Act. Because this is the missing piece of the political context. The Pujo hearings were a congressional investigation into the money trust, the concentration of financial power in the hands of a few large banks, primarily Morgan's network. The investigation found that a small interlocking group of financiers controlled enormous portions of American industry through overlapping board memberships and concentrated banking relationships. Morgan's name was everywhere. Hetty Green's name was not, which is the point. She had accumulated comparable liquidity without being part of the trust, without interlocking directorates, without network power, without the social club relationships that gave men like Morgan access to insider information and coordinated deal flow. She did it alone from a borrowed desk, eating cold oatmeal, carrying a revolver. While the Pujo Committee was describing the concentrated power of the money trust as a threat to democracy, in Hetty Green was the counterexample that nobody cited. Here is what financial power looks like when it operates outside the network, without leverage, without manipulation, without the social architecture of elite masculinity holding it up. She was the proof of concept for ethical accumulation. The living argument that you didn't have to corrupt the system to beat it. They investigated the system. They didn't investigate her, because she wasn't the problem. Here's the part that closes like a door. After the Federal Reserve is signed into law in December 1913, Hetty Green has 2 years and 7 months left to live. She keeps working. She is 79 years old. The strokes begin in April 1916. The first one takes feeling from the left side of her body. She does not stop working immediately. She is Hetty Green. She has never stopped for anything, but the body has its own accounting. In the weeks after the first stroke, she is at Ned's home in New York City. She is partially paralyzed. She is 81 years old. She has outlived her husband, most of her competitors, most of the men who called her a witch, most of the men who testified against her in the Howland will case. Most of the men who tried to take from her what she had spent a lifetime building. She has outlived the era. The Federal Reserve is 2.5 years old. The financial system she helped stabilize in 1907 now has institutional mechanisms she helped prove were necessary. The panic of 1907 has been studied, legislated around, partially addressed. The lender of last resort now exists by act of Congress, not by the grace of one woman at a borrowed desk. On July 3, 1916, Hetty Green dies. The New York Times obituary runs on the front page. They spend 4 paragraphs on the oatmeal. And now I need you to hold the second callback, the one I planted in the first 10 minutes of this story. The oatmeal on the radiator. You have spent, by now, hours understanding what that oatmeal actually was. It wasn't poverty. It wasn't mental illness. It wasn't the symptom of a broken mind unable to enjoy wealth. It was discipline. It was the physical embodiment of a principle. Every dollar not spent on lunch was a dollar available to deploy when the next panic came. The Federal Reserve Act, ratified in 1913, contains provisions that require member banks to hold reserves, liquid assets that can be deployed in a crisis, not invested in speculative ventures, not leveraged into complex instruments, held in reserve. The Economist called it reserve requirements. Hetty Green called it oatmeal on the radiator. She left everything to Ned and Sylvia, split evenly. No charitable bequests, no complicated structures. Just, here's what I protected, don't lose it. Ned, of course, lost it immediately and spectacularly and on purpose. But Sylvia, the quiet daughter who had lived with Hetty in the boarding houses, who had moved under false names, who had grown up in the particular paranoid discipline of a woman who trusted no one, Sylvia held. Sylvia Howland Green Wilkes died in 1951 with an estate worth approximately $95 million, over $1 billion in today's money. Her will was found stuffed in a tin cabinet alongside 4 cakes of soap. She left $5,000 to her closest living relative. She left the rest, $95 million, to 63 charities, hospitals, libraries, colleges, churches. The Fire Department of New York received $3 million. New York City commissioned a Fireboat in her honor, launched in 1958. They named it the Sylvia Wilkes. Hetty spent 50 years protecting that money. Her daughter gave it away to everyone, and the money did extraordinary good. Students learned, patients healed, firefighters were honored. The Fireboat named Sylvia Wilkes ran harbor operations for decades. None of it would have existed without the oatmeal. None of it would have existed without the dress. None of it would have existed without the radiator and the borrowed desk, and 30 years of being called a witch by men who couldn't understand that the thing she was doing was the thing they should all be doing. And now, the third callback, the last one, his name, J.P. Morgan. We planted it at the beginning. We have returned to it in every chapter. Morgan's marble library, Morgan's locked door, Morgan's newspaper tributes, the history books that say his name and not hers, the textbooks that teach his rescue and erase her loans. Here is the final thing to understand about J.P. Morgan and Hetty Green. He died in 1913. The same year the Federal Reserve Act was signed. He never saw what came after. He never had to reckon with the institution built on the argument his crisis created. She lived until 1916. She lived long enough to see Congress pass the law that institutionalized what she had done privately. She lived long enough to know that the United States government had looked at 1907, studied what went wrong, and built a permanent mechanism to ensure it could never happen again. She lived long enough to understand that she was the last of something, the last individual who would ever function as America's lender of last resort, the last person for whom the discipline of keeping cash, personal cash, private cash, no leverage cash, could move the needle on the survival of an entire financial system. After her, the Federal Reserve would hold those reserves. After her, the function would belong to institutions, not individuals. She was the last of her kind, and she knew it. Now let me tell you the last thing, the thing that has never been properly said. The Federal Reserve was designed to be independent, to operate outside political pressure, to make decisions based on financial reality rather than popular sentiment. In other words, to be contrarian, to act when others panic, to lend when others hoard, to hold reserves when the market is drunk on euphoria, and deploy them when the market is paralyzed by fear. Sound familiar? This is the philosophy of the woman they called a witch, institutionalized. federalized, taught in economics departments across the country, but taught without her name. They took her strategy. They put it in a law. They gave it a building in Washington and 12 regional headquarters and a chairman who testifies before Congress. And somewhere in the records of October 1907, a woman in a black dress is eating cold oatmeal at a borrowed desk and writing checks to save a city that will forget her name within a decade. She was right about everything. That's what they couldn't forgive. Her own words. New York Times, February 1908. The last voice in this chapter is hers. There is no great secret in fortune making. All you have to do is buy cheap and sell dear, act with thrift and shrewdness, and be persistent. Pause. I believe in getting in at the bottom and out at the top. When I see a good thing going cheap because nobody wants it, I buy a lot of it and tuck it away. Pause. I had the cash, and they had to come to me. Let that sit. The Federal Reserve exists because she proved the concept. The concept has a building now. She has a caricature in a book about world records. And in Chapter 6, we are going to watch a century of that erasure happen in real time and ask one very uncomfortable question about who benefits when a woman this powerful is remembered as a miser rather than a mind. The erasure didn't happen all at once. That's the part that should make you angry. Not a single decision, not one editor, one historian, one publisher who looked at the evidence and said no. It was slower than that, more patient, more deliberate. It happened the way water dissolves stone, year by year, decade by decade, one textbook at a time, one encyclopedia entry at a time, one children's book at a time, and by the time anyone noticed, the stone was gone. Let's start with a number, not a dollar figure, a different kind of number. When Hetty Green died in July 1916, she was covered in every major newspaper in America. The New York Times ran her obituary with genuine weight. The financial press acknowledged her genius. Even papers that had mocked her for 30 years recognized, in those first days after her death, that something extraordinary had left the room. That recognition lasted approximately 4 years. By 1920, the dominant public story about Hetty Green had already been restructured. The financial genius narrative was shrinking. The eccentric miser narrative was growing. The specific details being amplified were not the ones about the Federal Reserve or the city of New York or the railroad bonds. They were the ones about the dress, the oatmeal, the boarding houses. Ask yourself, who benefits from that version of the story? Here is something historians call narrative capture. It happens when the most emotionally satisfying version of a story becomes the dominant version, regardless of whether it is the most accurate version. The miser narrative is emotionally satisfying in a very specific way. It tells women that great wealth without great generosity makes you a monster. It tells people that extreme discipline looks like mental illness. It tells the public that a woman who refuses to perform warmth and sociability deserves ridicule. These are not neutral lessons. They are instructions. And for 100 years, those instructions were delivered through the story of Hetty Green. Now I want to plant something. I want you to hold a single word, not which. We've closed that one, a new word. The word is eccentric. Keep it close, because we're coming back to it. And when we come back, it's going to mean something completely different than it does right now. Here's the mechanism of the erasure, broken down simply, because the details matter. In the 1920s and 1930s, the first wave of popular history books about the Gilded Age were written. These were not academic histories. They were aimed at general readers. They wanted drama. They wanted characters. They wanted the robber baron narrative, Andrew Carnegie building libraries, John D. Rockefeller giving away dimes, J.P. Morgan saving civilization. Hetty Green fit none of those frames. She didn't build libraries. She didn't give away dimes. She didn't save civilization in a way that made for good copy. Because saving civilization through disciplined liquidity management during a financial panic is not a story with a dramatic visual. There's no locked door. There's no locked room. There's no marble palazzo. There's just a woman at a desk writing checks. So, the popular histories made a choice. They put her in the chapter on eccentrics, not the chapter on financial titans. They included the oatmeal story, the dress story, the boarding house story, and they mentioned the son's leg. They did not mention the Federal Reserve. They did not mention the Pujo Committee. They did not mention that she had been present in the room where the men who built modern American finance made their emergency decisions. They turned her into a footnote about frugality, and they filed the footnote under colorful. By the 1940s and 1950s, the erasure had moved into a new phase. Children's education. School textbooks of that era, covering the Gilded Age, covering American finance, featured Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Morgan. They featured the great captains of industry building the railroads, the steel mills, the oil fields. Hetty Green does not appear in those textbooks, not as a footnote, not as a sidebar, not even as a cautionary tale. She simply doesn't exist. Think about what that means for an entire generation of American schoolchildren learning about this period. The lesson delivered to them, implicitly, without anyone saying it out loud, is that the Gilded Age was built by men, that finance was a male domain, that the only powerful actors in the room were the ones with marble libraries and locked doors. The woman with the checks simply wasn't there. And then came the Guinness book. You already know what it said. But let's look at what it did, because this is the piece. The chapter before this one didn't have time to examine. The Guinness Book of World Records, which reached millions of households, which parents bought their children as gifts, which sat on family bookshelves next to encyclopedias and atlases, listed Hetty Green as the world's greatest miser, not as the world's greatest female investor, not as the richest self-made woman in American history, not as a pioneer of value investing whose methods preceded Benjamin Graham by half a century. Miser. And the entry that millions of children read, the entry that shaped the first impression of Hetty Green for an entire generation of people who would never go looking for anything more, described a woman who was pathologically cheap, who possibly caused her son's leg to be amputated through her refusal to spend money on a doctor, and who allegedly died arguing about skim milk. That last detail, the skim milk. There is no credible primary source for it. The New York Times did not report it. Contemporary accounts did not record it. No, it is almost certainly apocryphal. A story that was invented because it fit the miser template so perfectly that someone, somewhere, decided it was too good not to include. And it appeared in a book that presented itself as a factual record of human achievement, presented as fact, filed under achievement, the achievement being her cheapness. Now I want to come back to the word I planted, eccentric. Here is what eccentric means when it is applied to men in business history. Visionary, unconventional, ahead of their time. Howard Hughes, eccentric. Nikola Tesla, eccentric. Steve Jobs, eccentric. The word in a male context means genius that doesn't fit the mold. It is used admiringly, even when it acknowledges difficult behavior. Here is what eccentric means when it is applied to women in business history: unstable, unreliable, too emotional, damaged. The word in a female context becomes a diagnosis. It signals that her power was accidental, that her success was despite herself, that she cannot be taken seriously as a model because she was not well. Every article written about Hetty Green between 1920 and 1990 uses the word eccentric. Every article, without exception. And in every one of those articles, eccentric is doing the same work. It is saying, don't learn from her. Don't try to understand the system behind the behavior. Don't ask whether the dress and the oatmeal and the boarding houses were strategy. Just accept that she was strange and move on. The word eccentric is the softened version of witch. Same function. More respectable packaging. They stopped calling her a witch in print around 1916. They started calling her eccentric instead, and the sentence changed. The meaning didn't. Now let's talk about what was happening to other women in finance during those same decades, because this is not an isolated story. In the 1920s, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They had just won the right to vote in 1920. Many of them were interested in investing, in building independent financial lives, in understanding the market that Hetty Green had navigated alone for 50 years. What models did they have? The textbooks didn't show them Hetty Green as a strategist. Popular history showed them Hetty Green as a cautionary tale about what happens when you love money more than people. The Guinness book showed them Hetty Green as the world's worst miser. The implicit message, delivered through every available cultural channel, was consistent. Financial power in a woman is pathological. It is not genius. It is not discipline. It is sickness. And this mattered. Not just for individual women making individual choices about their lives. It mattered structurally, institutionally, for decades of financial culture. Every woman who might have seen herself in Hetty Green's story, who might have recognized her own contrarian instincts, her own willingness to be mocked for being disciplined, her own capacity to hold cash while everyone else spent, was instead handed a freak show and told that was the only available ending. The erasure wasn't just historical, it was instructional. But here is where the century turns. In the 1980s and 1990s, something changed in how financial history was being reconsidered. Partly this was academic. Feminist historians were doing serious archival work, recovering women's stories from the margins of institutional records. Partly, it was market-driven. The investing world was obsessed with Warren Buffett, and scholars tracing the intellectual genealogy of value investing kept arriving at the same unexpected name. Benjamin Graham had codified value investing in 1934 with security analysis. Buffett had learned from Graham, but who had Graham learned from? When scholars started looking backward, not at the theory, but at the practice, they kept finding Hetty Green, the same principles, the same instincts, the same patient, cash-heavy, contrarian approach to markets. 50 years before Graham put it in a textbook, academic papers began appearing with uncomfortable titles. Financial historians started giving lectures about the woman who had invented the strategy they were teaching. Some journalists picked it up. A small revival began. But something strange happened to that revival. Even the positive retellings, the ones that acknowledged her genius, couldn't quite let go of the eccentric frame. Articles celebrated her investing while simultaneously spending 3 paragraphs on the dress. Books honored her contrarian philosophy while opening every chapter with the oatmeal story. The rehabilitation was real, and it was incomplete because the dress was still being used as a joke. The oatmeal was still being used as evidence of something wrong. The behavior that had made her the most liquid investor in America, at the moment, America most needed liquidity, that behavior was being honored in the first paragraph and quietly pathologized in the third. You cannot fully rehabilitate someone while continuing to use their survival strategy as proof of their damage. And this brings us to something I think about constantly when I look at this story. There is a woman alive right now, maybe a lot of women, who saves aggressively, who drives a car 10 years older than she can afford to replace, who wears clothes that are functional, not fashionable, who moves her money carefully, keeps cash reserves that her friends think are excessive, refuses to speculate on things she doesn't understand, holds through downturns that make everyone around her panic sell. And the people in her life, kindly, warmly, with genuine concern, tell her she should enjoy herself more, that she's being too intense about money, that she doesn't have to be so careful, that she should live a little. They use the word eccentric. They don't know they're using Hetty Green's word. They don't know they're delivering, through genuine affection, the same message that a century of popular history delivered through ridicule. But they are. The erasure didn't end with the textbooks. It embedded itself in the culture. It became the water we all swim in. So, what does it mean to actually recover her? Not the dress, not the oatmeal, not the eccentric miser safely filed under colorful, the actual her. It means understanding that the discipline was the point, that every choice that looked irrational from the outside, the boarding houses, the borrowed desk, the black dress worn until it disintegrated, was the physical expression of a financial philosophy so sound that Congress eventually built a federal institution around it. It means understanding that the word miser was applied to her because the alternative, calling her a genius and meaning it, changing the textbooks and meaning it, teaching her strategy in business schools and meaning it, would have required acknowledging that an excluded woman had built the most robust financial operation in America, while the men writing her off were leveraging themselves into ruin. And that acknowledgement has costs for the men who write the textbooks, for the institutions that decide whose stories get told, for the culture that profits from the idea that financial mastery in a woman is pathology. So, they kept calling her eccentric. They kept filing her under miser. They kept putting the oatmeal in the first sentence and burying the Federal Reserve in a footnote nobody read. For 100 years. Here's the final thing. She knew it was coming, not the Federal Reserve. We covered what she understood about that in the last chapter. Something else. Something quieter. There is a line from an interview she gave in the early 1900s, before the strokes, before Ned's inheritance, before Sylvia and the Fireboat. A reporter asked her whether she thought women would ever be accepted as equals in finance. She paused. Then she said, "I think it will be a long time. Men don't like to admit they can learn from a woman. They will use what she teaches them and forgets who taught it." She said that. Before the Federal Reserve Act existed, before the Guinness book called her a miser, before 100 years of textbooks erased her name from the chapter she belonged in. She already knew, and she kept working anyway. That is not the behavior of an eccentric. That is not the behavior of a miser. That is not the behavior of a damaged woman who loved money more than people. That is the behavior of someone who understood, with absolute clarity, that the work was the only thing that couldn't be taken from her. Not the credit, not the recognition, not the seat at the table, but the work itself, the bonds, the railroads, the mortgages, the checks written at the borrowed desk. That would outlast everything they said about her. And it did. The money she protected became the Fireboat that ran New York Harbor for decades under her daughter's name. The strategy she perfected became the philosophy Warren Buffett turned into the most famous investment career in American history. The function she performed during the worst financial panic of the Gilded Age became, 6 years after her death, an act of Congress. The work survived. The name almost didn't. Now I am going to ask you one question. One, and I want you to sit with it. If Hetty Green had been Henry Green, same fortune, same strategy, same crisis loans, same Federal Reserve blueprint, do you believe for 1 second that the history books would have spent a century writing about his oatmeal? You already know the answer. The question isn't whether she deserves to be recovered. She does. The question is, what does it say about the stories we've been handed, as education, as culture, as fact, that we had to come here 110 years after she died to hear her actual story for the first time? What else have they been holding from us? There is a moment somewhere between the 3rd and 4th decade of Erasure when a story stops being forgotten and starts being deliberately kept that way. This is that moment, and you need to understand the difference. Because forgetting is passive. Forgetting is just time doing what time does to everything that isn't defended. But keeping something buried, that's a choice. That's maintenance. That requires people in every generation deciding that a particular version of a particular story is the one that gets to stand. For 110 years, those people made that choice about Hetty Green. And here is what they were protecting. I want to plant something before we go any further. Not a word this time. A number. Hold this number, 41. Don't let it go. It will matter before this chapter ends, and when it lands, I need you to feel the full weight of it. 41. Let's begin where the last chapter ended, not in 1916, not with the Obituaries, not with the miser caricature hardening into mythology. Let's begin somewhere more specific. Let's begin in 1928, 12 years after her death. Her son Ned, Edward Howland Robinson Green, the man who inherited approximately $50 million and promptly built the largest private yacht in America, hired a full-time numismatist to manage his coin collection, and kept a radio station at his Texas estate that he used primarily to broadcast music to himself. Ned is managing what remains of his mother's legacy. And managing is a generous word. Ned is spending, magnificently, defiantly, almost therapeutically spending. The yacht, the radio tower, the poker games, the women, the rare stamps, the cars, 22 of them, including a custom-built bus fitted with a bedroom and a filing cabinet. He buys a rare 2.5-cent stamp error known as the inverted Jenny that becomes one of the most famous philatelic finds in American history. He collects, he spends, he burns through what his mother built, with what can only be described as the joyful exhaustion of a man who has been waiting his entire life to do exactly this. He isn't stupid. He knows what he's doing. He said so, explicitly, to a reporter who asked whether he felt guilty about the spending. His answer was characteristically direct. She spent her whole life saving it. I spent my whole life watching her save it. I figure the entertainment value alone is worth the price. The entertainment value. There it is. the son of the most financially disciplined woman in American history, framing his inheritance as theater. Here's what that tells you, and it's not what most people assume. It doesn't tell you that Hetty failed him. It tells you that the only rebellion available to a man who grew up in the shadow of that discipline, who wore a cork leg his whole life and carried that weight, real and figurative, every single day, was extravagance. It tells you that her influence was so total, so inescapable, that the only way to escape it was to invert it completely. Even in his spending, he was defined by her. She shaped him so thoroughly that his independence required destroying everything she built, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. He died in 1936. He had outlasted his inheritance. Not entirely. There was still money, but the figure he received in 1916 was not the figure that remained when he died 20 years later. His daughter Mabel, from the relationship Hetty had spent years trying to prevent, inherited what was left of his share. Sylvia's share is a different story, and this is where the 41 becomes relevant, though we're not there yet. Hold it. 41. Now, let's talk about what was happening in the broader world while Ned was spending, and Sylvia was quietly managing her portion of the estate. 1929. The stock market collapses. And this is the moment where Hetty Green's story, had it been told honestly, should have become the most important financial lesson in American history. Because the crash of 1929 was not, at its core, a mystery. It was not an unforeseen catastrophe. It was the exact scenario. Asset price inflation built on leverage, speculation divorced from fundamental value, a market where everyone believed the machine would keep running forever, that she had been describing and surviving and profiting from since the 1870s. Her playbook existed. Every crisis she'd navigated had followed the same architecture, and the playbook worked. Not once, not twice, but 6 times across 50 years of her active investing life. But when 1929 arrived, and the banks collapsed, and families lost everything, and breadlines formed outside the same financial institutions that had laughed at her borrowed office and her heated oatmeal, nobody said her name. Nobody said, there was a woman on this street 50 years ago who knew exactly what this was and exactly how to survive it. Nobody made that connection because the connection required knowing she existed in a useful way. Not as a cautionary tale about miserliness, not as a curiosity about female eccentricity, but as a strategist, as someone who had cracked the code. And the history they'd handed the public didn't have room for that version. So, 1929 came and went, and Benjamin Graham, surviving the crash, learning from it, building a theoretical framework out of the rubble, wrote Security Analysis in 1934, a foundational text, a genuinely brilliant work. What Graham codified: buy when prices are below intrinsic value, maintain a margin of safety, avoid leverage, think long-term, treat market volatility as opportunity rather than threat. The framework was real. The insight was profound. The timing was extraordinary, and not one line in Security Analysis mentioned Hetty Green. Now let's be precise about something, because this is not a claim about plagiarism. Benjamin Graham did not steal from Hetty Green. He arrived at similar conclusions through his own experience and analysis. That is genuinely possible. Brilliant people reach the same answers independently all the time. But consider what it means that he didn't mention her, not as a predecessor, not as an early practitioner, not even as an interesting historical parallel. he wouldn't have known to. Because the story available to him, to anyone doing research in 1934, looking at who had navigated American financial markets with discipline and precision, that story placed her in the eccentric miser file, not the financial philosopher file. The erasure had already worked. By the time the framework that validated everything she did was being built, the person who had built it first was filed under colorful history. This is not irony. This is consequence. The century of deliberate misframing had a real cost, not just to her legacy, but to the intellectual history of finance itself. A tradition she founded was built on top of her, with her name sanded off from the foundation. Now, 41. That number I asked you to hold. Sylvia Ann Howland Green, the daughter who married late, at 38, to a 63-year-old man named Matthew Astor Wilkes, the daughter who was the quieter of Hetty's two children, the daughter who inherited her share of the estate and managed it carefully, as her mother had taught her, in ways the press found far less interesting than Ned's spectacular spending. Sylvia died in 1951. She was 80 years old. And when she died, the terms of her will became public. She left $41 million to charity. $41 million in 1951, which translates, in today's purchasing power, to something in the range of $500 million. Not to family, not to a trust that would compound privately for another generation, to charity, hospitals, educational institutions, and specifically, and this is the one that I need you to sit with, to the city of New York, in the same city her mother had bailed out, with a $1.1 million loan in 1907 when no one else would. The city that had let her mother work from a borrowed desk and live in boarding houses under false names while being mocked in its newspapers. That city received, in 1951, the culmination of everything Hetty Green had built and protected and disciplined herself into near isolation to preserve. The Fireboat funded by the estate, the Sylvia Wilkes running in New York Harbor for decades, that was already documented in the chapter before this one. But what wasn't documented is this: the scale of the giving. $41 million across charitable institutions. And the largest portion went to a city that had never, not once, said thank you. She didn't know they would do it. She was dead by then. But she built the machine, the philosophy, the discipline, the structure. That made it possible. And her daughter, who had inherited not just the money, but the values, made the choice about where it should go. Hetty Green's fortune, in its final form, became one of the largest charitable distributions by any private individual in American history up to that point. The miser built a gift that lasted decades, filed under eccentric, filed under colorful, filed under the woman who argued about skim milk. The gift happened anyway. Now let's talk about the rehabilitation and why it was so incomplete for so long, and why that incompleteness is itself a story worth examining. The first serious modern biographies of Hetty Green appeared in the 1960s and 1970s. These were genuine scholarly efforts, researchers going back to primary sources, reading the court records, and looking at the financial documents, trying to construct a picture of her that went beyond the caricature. And they succeeded. Partly, they established the factual record, her fortune, her strategy, her role in the 1907 panic, her presence at Morgan's meetings, her lending to New York City. They acknowledged that the miser narrative was constructed, exaggerated, and weaponized. But they couldn't let go of the lens. Even the sympathetic biographies spent enormous amounts of time on the dress, the oatmeal, the boarding houses, as if these details, however explained and contextualized, were still the most interesting thing about her. As if the biography of the woman who practiced value investing 50 years before Benjamin Graham was most compelling when it focused on what she ate for lunch. This is what incomplete rehabilitation looks like. It changes the verdict but keeps the frame. And the frame matters because the frame determines what questions people ask next. If you frame Hetty Green as an eccentric who happened to be good at investing, the next question is, how strange was she, really? You get more decades of articles about the dress and the oatmeal, just with a sympathetic spin. If you frame Hetty Green as a strategist who happened to live in the 19th century, the next question is, what can we learn from her? You get a completely different conversation, one about financial philosophy, about value investing, about the history of women in finance, about what happens when an extraordinary practitioner is systematically excluded from the intellectual tradition she helped build. The first frame produces curiosity. The second produces transformation. For most of the 20th century, the first frame won, even among the people who were trying to recover her story. Here is when things started to genuinely shift. And you'll notice the timing is not accidental. In the 1990s and early 2000s, two things happened simultaneously in the cultural conversation about finance. First, Warren Buffett had become, by that point, the most celebrated investor in the world. His methods were being studied, analyzed, reverse engineered. Scholars were tracing the intellectual genealogy of his approach. Graham to Buffett, Graham to Dodd, the Columbia Business School lineage, the whole documented history of value investing as a formal discipline. And when those scholars looked further back, behind Graham, behind the formal texts, into the practical history of the American market in the 19th century, they kept arriving at the same name. The woman at the borrowed desk, the woman with the heated oatmeal, the woman who had predicted every crash from 1873 to 1907 and kept her cash ready every single time. The comparison between her methods and Buffett's was impossible to ignore once you saw it. The same principle of buying undervalued assets with a margin of safety. The same emphasis on cash reserves, what Buffett calls dry powder, as a strategic weapon rather than a failure of imagination. The same willingness to be mocked in the short term while the market vindicated the long-term thesis. The same contempt for debt and leverage. The same patience. Buffett himself, in interviews throughout the 1990s, acknowledged Hetty Green as a fascinating historical figure. He didn't claim her as a direct influence. He learned from Graham, not from her. But he recognized what he was looking at when he looked at her record. He said, on more than one occasion, that she had understood things about markets that most professional investors still get wrong. That was a significant statement. From the most credible voice in the investing world, at the height of his authority. It didn't make her a household name, but it opened a door. Second thing happening simultaneously, the women in finance conversation. The 1990s saw a meaningful increase in academic and journalistic attention to the history of women in American business and finance. Not just the obvious figures, not just the suffragettes and the labor organizers, but the women who had operated inside the financial system itself, often invisibly, often without credit. Hetty Green was the most obvious candidate in this conversation. She was undeniably the wealthiest woman to have operated on Wall Street in American history, up to that point. Her story was documented, more documented than most, because she was so prominent that even the hostile newspapers had preserved detailed records of her activities. But here's where the conversation got complicated in a way that's worth being precise about. The feminist rehabilitation of Hetty Green faced an uncomfortable tension. On one hand, her story was undeniably a story of a woman being systematically excluded, mocked, and erased, a story that belonged in the history of women's financial agency. Absolutely. On the other hand, she was not, in any conventional sense, a social progressive. She didn't advocate for women's rights. She didn't speak publicly about the challenges facing women in finance. She didn't use her platform, and she had one, the newspapers covered her constantly, to champion any cause beyond her own financial survival and success. She was not a crusader. She was a capitalist, a highly effective, completely unsentimental, deeply private capitalist who happened to be a woman. This made her complicated to hold up as a role model in the way that a movement might need a role model. She didn't fit the available narratives neatly, and this is where something important needs to be said directly without softening it. A woman doesn't have to be a feminist icon to deserve accurate history. She doesn't have to have used her success to uplift other women in order to be correctly remembered as a financial genius. The requirement that women's stories be inspiring in addition to being true is itself part of the problem. Hetty Green was difficult, private, unsentimental, and sometimes wrong. She may have contributed to her son's suffering through her discipline. She was not warm. She did not seem particularly concerned with being liked. And none of that changes what she did. None of it changes the fact that she built the largest fortune created by a self-directed investor, male or female, on Wall Street in the 19th century. And none of it changes the fact that she was present in the room during the most important financial intervention in pre-Federal Reserve American history, and that her contribution was substantial and documented, and that history removed her name anyway. The accurate version of her story doesn't require her to be a saint. It just requires her to be taken seriously. Let's talk about what taken seriously looks like in practice, because it's not simply about adding her name to lists of important women. It's structural. In 2011, a biography by Janet Wallach, the Queen of the Gilded Age, provided what was, to that point, one of the most complete portraits of Hetty Green drawn from primary sources. It was reviewed. It was noticed. It did not become a mainstream sensation. In 2014, she appeared in financial history texts as a predecessor to value investing. The connection to Graham and Buffett was being made explicitly in academic circles. In the mid-2010s, the conversation about women in finance, driven partly by an increasing awareness of how few women had ever been centered in financial history, and partly by a series of market events that had once again proven the value of exactly the kind of disciplined, liquidity-focused approach she had practiced, started including her name more consistently. And then slowly, something that feels almost like justice began to happen. She started appearing in lists that had never included her before. Not in the eccentric miser category, in the value investing pioneers category, in the financial history's forgotten figures category, in the business school case study category. Not everywhere, not in most places, but in enough places that for the first time in a century, the question being asked about her wasn't she strange? It was, why didn't we know about this? Why didn't we know about this? Let that question sit for a moment before I give you the answer, because the question itself is important. It's the right question. And the fact that so many people, smart, informed, historically curious people, are asking it now in a way that they weren't 30 years ago is itself evidence that something has shifted. The answer, the honest answer, is three things at once. First, the original Erasure was so thorough and so early that by the time serious scholarship began trying to recover her, the caricature had calcified into received fact. Undoing calcified facts requires extraordinary effort, more effort than the initial lie required. The lie was planted once. The correction has to be planted over and over. Second, she was a complicated figure to rehabilitate because she was a complicated person. The incomplete stories, the unanswerable questions. Did her cheapness cost her son his leg? Did she know the second will was fraudulent? These uncertainties made historians nervous. It is easier to tell a clean story. Her story is not clean. Third, and most importantly, the system that erased her was not broken. It worked exactly as designed. A financial culture built by men who needed to believe that mastery of capital was a masculine capacity had every incentive to file her under eccentric and keep that filing intact. The miser narrative was not an accident of sloppy journalism. It was a structural response to a woman who had no business being as powerful as she was, according to the architecture of the world she lived in. And who was powerful anyway? To tell her actual story requires acknowledging that the architecture was wrong, not just unfair to her specifically, fundamentally wrong about what financial genius looks like, who is capable of it, and why. That acknowledgement has costs. I want to come back now to something from very early in this story, something planted so far back that you may not remember it as a plant. From the very first chapter of this documentary, there was a moment, the cold open, the borrowed desk, the check, the oatmeal on the radiator, when the framing was introduced. Here is the woman they called a witch, writing the check that saved the city that would spend a century calling her a miser. That image was planted deliberately, not because it's dramatic, though it is, but because it's the precise compression of everything this story is. The desk is borrowed because she was never given a seat. The oatmeal is cold because she was never given time. The check is real because her money was real, her discipline was real, her strategy was real, more real than the marble library across town that got all the credit. And the word witch, which she first heard applied to herself sometime in the 1880s, which appeared in newspapers with casual cruelty for 3 decades, which we examined in Chapter 3 as a weapon constructed to do specific damage to a specific kind of power. That word, in the end, is not the last word. Because a witch, in the oldest sense of the word, before the burning, before the caricature, before they used it to mean woman to be feared and destroyed, a witch was simply a woman who knew things she wasn't supposed to know. She knew the crash was coming in 1873. She knew it was coming in 1884. She knew it was coming in 1890. She knew it in 1901 and 1903 and 1907. She knew it not because she had supernatural power, but because she had read the documents, done the arithmetic, and refused to let anyone, the press, her husband, her peers, the entire culture of performative optimism that built and destroyed fortunes on Wall Street every decade, tell her that what she could see clearly with her own eyes was not real. She knew. That is the thing they could not take from her. Not in her life, not in the century after her death, but not in any of the various moments when the miser story threatened to become the only story. She knew she was right, and the work, the actual, documented, verifiable work, survived. Now the pace slows. This is intentional. The story has been loud for 6 chapters. Let it quiet now. Sylvia Ann Howland Green Wilkes, the daughter, the quiet one, the one who married late and spent carefully and gave away $41 million to the city her mother had rescued and been ignored by. She is, in some ways, the most complete expression of what Hetty built. Not the fortune, the value system. Hetty was not a miser. Misers keep money because they are afraid. Hetty kept money because she understood exactly what it was for. Not display, not comfort, not social acceptance, but capacity. The capacity to act when everyone else is paralyzed. The capacity to lend when no one else can lend. The capacity to give when the machine has built enough and the giving finally makes sense. Sylvia understood that. She gave $41 million to hospitals, to institutions, to the city. The money moved. It did what Hetty had always known, quietly, that it would eventually do. It just took one more generation to arrive at that moment. There is something else. In 1957, the Fireboat that Sylvia's estate funded was commissioned into service in New York Harbor. It ran for years. It fought fires on the water. It saved cargo ships and piers and docks. It bore Sylvia's name, not Hetty's. Think about why that might be. Think about whether it's possible, given everything you now know about how this story was told and retold, that naming it for Sylvia rather than Hetty was itself an act of quiet correction. A way of honoring the legacy without attaching the name that had spent 50 years being used as a punchline. A practical decision. A gentle one. A decision that preserved the gift while shielding it from the distortion that Hetty's name would have attracted. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Sylvia just wanted her own name on something. She had spent her whole life in her mother's shadow. A fireboat in New York Harbor seems like a reasonable place to step out of it. Either way, the boat ran. The fires were fought. The harbor was protected. The work survived. I want to end with a thought that is not about Hetty Green specifically. It's about what her story means for the way we receive financial history, and by extension, all history. We inherit stories. We don't choose them. The stories we're handed arrive already framed, already filtered, already arranged to serve the purposes of whoever arranged them. And most of the time, we accept the arrangement because we have no reason to question it. We're not examining the frame. We're looking at the picture inside it. What this story demonstrates, in detail that is uncomfortable to sit with, is that the frame is always a choice. Always. Someone chose to call her eccentric instead of disciplined. Someone chose to lead with the oatmeal instead of the Federal Reserve. Someone chose to file her under colorful history instead of financial pioneer. Those were not inevitable outcomes of honest storytelling. They were decisions made across decades by many people in a culture that had strong incentives to make them. And the consequence of those decisions is not just that Hetty Green didn't get the credit she deserved. The consequence is that every person who might have learned from her, every woman who looked at history to understand what was possible in finance and found only the miser story, was deprived of something real, something useful, something true. The erasure had victims beyond her. She left us one thing that could not be erased. Not a quote this time, not an interview, something more permanent. The record, the actual financial record, the bonds purchased, The loans made. The panics survived. The railroads bought at distress prices and sold into recovery. The cash held while everyone else spent and borrowed. That record exists in court documents, in bank records, in newspaper archives that, if you read them carefully enough, show through even the most hostile framing the outlines of something extraordinary. The record shows a woman who understood that discipline is not the opposite of generosity, that patience is not the same as miserliness, that keeping your powder dry is not cowardice. It's the precondition for being useful when usefulness is what the moment demands. She was useful in 1873, in 1884, in 1890, in 1901, in 1903, in 1907, and through Sylvia, she was useful in 1951, when $41 million moved from a private estate into the public life of a city that had mocked the woman who earned it. There is one more thing I want to say before this door closes, and not about Hetty Green, about you. You have now spent hours with a story that most people who consider themselves financially educated have never heard told this way. You know things about the architecture of the 1907 panic that most people who discuss that panic don't know. You know the connection between her strategy and what the Federal Reserve was built to institutionalize. You know the difference between what she was and what she was called. That knowledge is yours now. It doesn't disappear when this video ends. And here's the thing about stories that have been deliberately kept buried. They don't recover through academic papers that 300 people read. They recover through conversations, through someone watching something like this, and then the next time someone uses the word miser or eccentric to dismiss a woman who is careful with money. The next time someone laughs at frugality as if it's a personality defect rather than a philosophy, speaking up. Actually, let me tell you about someone. That's how the Erasure ends. Not with a single biography or a single documentary or a single academic rehabilitation. With enough people knowing the actual story that the caricature stops having anywhere to land. She built the machine. Sylvia ran it forward. The harbor fireboat ran until it was decommissioned. Now you carry the record. The final voice in this story does not belong to me. It belongs to her, directly, exactly as she said it, to a reporter for the New York Times in the winter of 1908, just months after the panic she had predicted, survived, and profited from. He asked her whether she resented the way the newspapers had treated her. She paused for a long time. Then she said, "I am not afraid of them. I never was. The only thing that ever frightened me was being wrong about the money. And I was never wrong about the money. She was not. Now, while the door is still closing, whose story are you carrying that the history books decided wasn't worth telling? Because I promise you this, Hetty Green is not the only one."